I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a UK-based certified social enterprise. We have people that get our correspondence and our newsletter in 21 countries around the world, 6,500 of them. And within that community, we have a few hundred people who I would describe as campaigning activists, people like me who are genuinely passionate about the need for change. Change is the key word here. What we do is all about driving change. We have a strategy for driving change. It's about bringing together two sets of people. On one hand, those like us who have a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. And on the other hand, those who have the power and the position to make change possible. And Transparency Task Force is a deliberate attempt, a deliberate endeavor, a deliberate collective endeavor to bring those two groups together so that the changes that we want to see can and actually will happen. We operate in many, many ways. Campaigns, we've done a rally, we talk to politicians often, we talk to people in the media often, but above all else, we talk to each other. And that process of talking to each other can sometimes be profoundly interesting and take us into all kinds of areas that really do stimulate our thoughts and frankly get us rather agitated. For me, the particular issue we're talking about today, the libel scandal, the libel rigging, I frankly knew nothing about this topic at all until a remarkable podcast series by Andy Verity called The Lowball Tapes. I listened to it. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Real hard proof that there's been collusion, cover-up, even corruption in the heart of the city, and not only involving market participants, people in the business, so to speak, but also, it would appear, people in some way involved with the Treasury, with the government, with the Bank of England, etc. I was blown over by the Lowball tapes. We then set up a meeting. Andy Verity and other traders involved with this story came along. And after that, we organised monthly meetings. We called it our Lowball Snowball group. And the thing we've all been really looking forward to is the publishing of Andy Verity's book, in the hope that it might be shining a big, bright light into the nooks and crannies and the shadows that have thus far enabled the people that should be investigated and prosecuted getting away with it, and the people that ended up being investigated, prosecuted, and jailed, put away. Last Tuesday, I had the privilege of attending a meeting in Parliament that I will never, ever forget in my life. It's when Andy was speaking about his book, John McDonnell MP, talking about the idea of getting an inquiry opened. Then we had several of the traders, including Carlo, who's here today, talking about their life experience. People were either crying in listening to this or just about stopping themselves from doing so. That's how powerful it was. People in that room felt ashamed, hearing of how badly our system dealt with the innocent people and failed to deal with the people that should have been dealt with very harshly. We're talking here about collusion, corruption, and cover-up. And we are talking about what must be some of the most hideous, heinous, and frankly horrific miscarriage of justice that this country's ever seen, that could be imagined. Everybody that's talked to me about this topic is basically saying the same thing. They've read the book and they are in a state of semi-shock about what's actually happened without being properly held to account. If you haven't already done so, do the obvious thing of buying the book. We're going to be hearing from Andy Verity soon. The TTF has had the pleasure of knowing Andy for a period of maybe about a year or so. Regardless of the book, we've been remarkably impressed with what he's been doing and the way he's been going about his professional broadcasting and media career. The book itself, we are hoping and praying, is going to be something of a game changer. It's almost like a battering ram against the thick concrete walls, the impregnable until now concrete walls of BS covering up the truth. It's like a piece of armor-piercing artillery that's finally, please God, finally going to break through the protective cloak around the system that has meant that people have ended up going to jail when they shouldn't have been there. They literally didn't commit any crimes, but they still end up in jail. How can a whistleblower spend 12, 18 months or so trying to tell the company he's working for that he seriously thinks there's something dodgy going on, and diligently and ethically and professionally go about doing that? How can he somehow end up in jail? How can this be happening? How can this be happening? The key word tonight, folks, is change. If Andy's book fails to initiate the change that we must now demand, then it's in the streets, folks, bloody protesting outside Parliament and wherever else we need to make sure that the truth gets into the open and respected. Thank goodness for people like Andy Verity. Thank goodness for people like David Davis MP, John McDonnell MP, and the absolutely off the scale resilience and tenacity and integrity of these poor souls who've ended up going to jail when they shouldn't have done. Can we please give Andy Verity the loudest applause we've ever given anybody, because he's doing something of massive strategic importance here. Andy Verity, we salute you, sir. We really do. We really do. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Andy, you're in your garden. I hope you're relaxed. Take it away. Do what you do. Speak from the heart and tell us what you'd like to share with tonight. After you, Andy, we've got Matt Conley and some of the other boys. Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, from the heart, I can say I am blessed to have such nice words uttered by somebody who cares so much, Andy. From the heart, I say I care more about the admiration and support and encouragement of people in this group and in the general public than I do about the praise of my bosses or the beneficial view of the banking industry. Certainly, you can tell I don't care that much about that. Look, I mean, thank you very much. I just want to say thank you very much, and it's nice. It's great to have recognition of the higher goal of it, really, which is to, you know, it's not really a money-making enterprise, this book. I get about £3 for every one sold. Transparency. Okay, so if you buy one, I'll buy you a pint, and then actually you'll owe me money. Anyway, something like that. But it's great to see you all, and I'm hoping that I can inform you.
Andy, you might need to go back in the house despite the weather. You might need to. Just on the basis that it looks like we've got a bit of a hitch with Andy, we may need to come back to Andy. So can I please just check with Andy for a few seconds? And if not, we can't speak to Andy. We'll go straight to Matt Connolly. Okay, that's probably the only thing we can do. I think we're going to need to do that. We look forward to coming back to Andy. Mr. Matt Connolly, please introduce yourself and share with us what you'd like to say, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And I appreciate the invitation to be here. Really, your work at the Transparency Task Force is very important to me because that's what this is all about, which is trying to get the word out so that things like this stop happening. And the best way to do that is, we all say it, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I very much appreciate your efforts. Now, Andy's not on anymore, but maybe I'll have this conversation later with him. But I need to thank him in a huge way. And I need to thank Andy and the BBC together, because if it wasn't for their efforts, I would be in jail right now. At my sentencing, the US government was trying to lobby the judge to put me in jail for 15 years. The judge herself calculated a sentence of 4 years. And then she referenced some of Andy Verity's work, some of his investigating, some of the articles, some of the tapes, and she gave me no jail time. And she referenced his work in court, some of the things that he had unearthed. So I am convinced that without his work, I would have had to serve my 4 years in jail. Now, we won our appeal and we won a full acquittal about a year and a half ago. And a lot of that was also using information that Andy and the BBC published. And we're the only ones who would publish.
I'm back. I'm back. Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm back. But let's hear from you first. I can talk later.
Thanks. Carry on, Matt. Thank you. Cheers, Andy. All good. Thank you.
So Andy, I was just telling them that you kept me out of jail, and I would probably be in jail right now if it wasn't for you and the BBC, and that is absolutely the truth. So I can't thank you enough.
That's one of the most important. That you saying that is actually one of the most cherished things in my career. I've won awards, and a lot of them are bollocks. Hearing that from you is one of the best moments of my career.
Thank you. I mean every word of it. What you've done has, changed and improved my life, my family's life, and I'll forever be grateful to you for that. And that's really all I planned to say. I mean, you know me, I can talk and write for 7 hours of things that are useless, but I'm just looking forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. I've read Rigged. I bought it the first day it came out, and I spent the first 48 hours not sleeping but reading the whole thing. And what strikes me about it more than anything else is, for the people who think LIBOR is very complex and you can't understand it, the way Andy writes it, it's not about LIBOR, it's about people's actions and lying, and how people will do anything to save themselves, how people in power will protect other people in power at the expense of others. And it's a very human story in a financial book. And to me, that is what I was so happy to read as I was reading through it, because you've turned something financial that people will swear they can't understand into a story about perseverance, forgiveness,
the real meaning of honesty, Matt.
Yeah, and also, Andy A was saying before, maybe he's naive. I was naive. I mean, I'm still shocked to this day, and I have trust issues with everybody, because if you see people who you were friends with and people who you trusted turn on you the way a lot of us did, and not just me, Stelios, Carlo, I mean, that was rocking our worlds, stuff that I never thought could happen. And so I think it's important when people read your book who are still naive to know and have their eyes open to what people will do if you let them. Not everybody, but certain people, will do anything, say anything in order to save themselves. And your book takes a financial product and a financial scandal and makes it very human, good and bad, and I love it. And thank you,
Matt. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. In a moment, folks, we're going to go to Q&A. I know some of you have been following Matt's story very, very closely through social media and other things, and you may have specific questions that you'd love to ask Matt, and now's the chance to do it. So please prepare to ask a question or make a comment if you wish to in a moment. And after we've heard from Matt, we'll obviously go back to Andy. Matt, I've got one question for you, please. What is it like from an American's perspective that the UK is still clinging on to this idea that what the traders did was somehow wrong and illegal? What's your take on that, sir?
It's, I can be very harsh on the UK, and I just want everybody to know I love the UK. I'm just as harsh on the US, but the UK establishment is a very close-knit, small island sort of mentality, and a cover-up and hiding things and sweeping things under the rug happen all the time. We see it in the post office scandal. We see it in all the things that Andrew Candy, will talk about. It's, they all protect each other at the expense of, most of the time, it's the rank and file or the juniors. I mean, the elite, will protect and cover up. And so this is 100%, just the UK covering up for all the mistakes they made, allowing LIBOR to just become an absolutely broken product, then hiding it, and then, throwing us under the bus to hide what they did. So to me, this is not a matter of law. I refuse to believe that this is a matter of the UK having different laws. This is a matter of the UK continuing the cover up that they started 10 years ago to hide, what the Bank of England was doing, what the senior executives at the banks were doing. So, it's just a cover up that Andy is doing his best to blast through the concrete wall. And to me, that's just my opinion. That it's not even a matter of law. It's just a matter of continuing to hide things and deny them. I mean, the Bank of England and the FCA, they're all still denying what, there's 200 tapes, documents, and everything else, and they're still denying that they were, lowballing or getting Barclays to lowball. So it's delusional at this point. The amount of evidence is so overwhelming that it kind of makes me laugh when they continue to deny it.
Matt, thank you very, very much indeed. I think Andy Verity's frozen, so I'm hoping we'll be able to go to Andy shortly. If not, we'll have a plan B, or is it a plan C? Meanwhile, does anybody else have anything they'd like to come in with for Matt specifically? I'm thinking of, there's a couple of people here. So Ivan, please share your thought. Please be as succinct as you can, Ivan. But
I apologize, I have to leave, but we were debating the book, and there are some cynics that say it's not going to work. I believe the book demonstrates that there are absolute proofs of bad doing by our bosses up there. Could you get Andy to comment on that question, please?
Yeah, we will. Thank you, Ivan. We know you need to dash off shortly. Thank you very much, Ivan. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to come in on in relation to Matt specifically? Wave a hand or something at me. Mr. Paul Birch, you're next, sir. Thank you. Take yourself off mute, Paul.
Running. I'd just basically like to reiterate both what you, Andy, have said and also Matt, that it is an absolute scandal that the establishment covers up. I mean, Matt and Andy Verity have obviously concentrated on bank scandals and the LIBOR scam in particular. My beef is about pension scams, but the modus operandi are just the same. You have big financial institutions who basically are able to walk on water, and when you report their malfeasance to the regulators or law enforcement agencies, they just ignore it. They regard themselves as untouchable, and to date, they remain that.
Thank you, Paul. We're going to actually change the plan a little bit because we're going to go straight to Stelios. Stelios has got some constraints he needs to manage. We will come back to those of you that kindly put your hands up just now. I noticed Paul Carlier, for example. Stelios, we know that you have a constraint you need to deal with, so please do take the opportunity now, Stelios, to share with us what you'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to be relatively brief.
Hi, Stelios. Nice to see
Hey,
you.
Andy. Hey. First of all, I'm just gonna touch on three things. First of all, when this whole story started, and I was lost, right? I was thrust in the spotlight, and all I could see was media following what basically the banks and the government was saying. There was one person who stopped and thought about, hey, maybe there's something else here, and that was Andy. And so I want to say, huge thank you to him, because he fought and fought. We all know what he's done, and he's uncovered everything. The thing that really, the second thing, was shocked me. I've received the book 2 days ago. I haven't had the chance to read it all. I'm in the middle of it. The amount of information that I'm finding out now, which I didn't know before, the amount of information that people knew that was hidden from us. I knew for a fact that there was a lot of evidence that was not brought into the trials. I knew a lot of it was not allowed by the judge, which was ridiculous because it was completely relevant, but it was disallowed because apparently it wasn't relevant. But now I'm reading about things about Peter Johnson and what he'd done before. I didn't know all that, and now I'm finding it out, and I'm shocked. So the extent of the cover-up and collusion, I thought it was up to level A. Well, it's A squared. I just cannot believe what was happening. And, I just want to thank all of you and both Andys, for really working hard at this, trying to get the truth out, because at the end of the day, we've talked with Matt about it. I don't want this to happen to anybody else. I was lucky enough, and that's the third point I want to talk about. I was lucky enough not to spend jail time, but my life in that respect was destroyed. And people say to me, oh, it's okay, you went through this, but hey, you didn't do jail time. Well, everything I worked for 20 years, 25 years of my life to get there, it's destroyed. And as soon as I was acquitted, I started looking around and saying, what can I do professionally? Every door was shut, every door. I was tainted for life. And it's something that is really difficult to handle because I didn't do anything wrong. You all know the story. And also it's not the effect on me, it's the effect on my family, on everybody around me. It was a battle that you really need nerves of steel and a really solid support network to make it through. This thing is something that can break a man or a woman. I just want to say it's been a hell of a trip, and I really hope, not for me, for everybody else, for the world, I hope this makes a difference, that the people up top who think they can get away with everything, that the next time there's a situation like this, they're going to say, oh shit, remember, sorry, pardon my language, you can bleep that out. Remember what happened to X and Y. Maybe we should think twice about, throwing people out under the bus and doing what these people were doing. So, I hope your efforts and, all our efforts, and people like Matt and Carlo and everybody involved, I hope that this makes a difference, because that's the goal. We don't want people to be in the situation like we have.
Yes.
And that's what I wanted to say. It's I can talk for hours as well, but that's the gist of it.
Fantastic. We're going to say thank you to Stelios for what he said so far, and to Matt, and then we're going to go straight to Andy. Can we please show our appreciation for Matt and Stelios, not just for what they've said today, but for everything they've somehow managed to survive and getting them to this point here. Mr. Verity, there's a lot of love for you, sir, and I'm not at all surprised. You deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say that for everybody who's engaged with this in the way that I've been engaging it with it for years now, thank you for your attention, your time, and for having a heart. caring. Stelios, it's so marvelous to see you. I'm slightly envious because you look like you're outside some sort of lovely Greek taverna or something, you know. I imagine the seas nearby, but that's the image we have of Greece. But there's a line actually in one of the trials where Stelios is supposedly bribing Peter Johnson to publish a corrupt rate. And he jokes and says, you know, you can come to my Greek taverna and I'll when I've got my wealth, and you know, and you can be in the book when I write about this. And Peter Johnson has just adjusted his libel submission by 1 basis point, and that was the Crown's best piece of evidence against Peter Johnson. One of the things that made him decide to plead guilty, and yet it was just a silly joke, just like the bottle of Bollinger that all us journalists got so excited about. That man you just heard from was the one who was supposedly offering champagne to the other trader to celebrate corrupt practice of setting LIBOR. And what I remember was in 2012, there was a lot of frustration in the media. You know, everybody at the BBC, lots of other places was really cross with the banks because no one had swung for the biggest financial calamity in 80 years. The worst you'd seen was a man losing his knighthood. You already had this sense of an elite protecting itself, of how accountability is different at the top. Tim Geithner, the then US Treasury Secretary, I think, or he was in charge of dealing with the crisis anyway. He was first president of the Fed and then later Treasury Secretary, and he's also high up in banking. So he's already part of that sort of that pampered elite, that sort of aristocracy of the financial world who know each other and talk to each other. And when they know someone like the guy who runs the bank, that's the chaps, as Adrian Derbyshire put it in Stelios's trial. You don't do something to the chaps, those people you meet with for dinner. You don't throw them under the bus. That's the Old Testament view that you should condemn the bankers for screwing up the entire world economy and costing us £66 billion. You shouldn't condemn anyone for that. That's the Old Testament view, Old Testament justice. And one theme that goes through my head is, because I was raised a Christian, I'm an atheist now, but I was raised a Christian, is the difference between Old Testament justice and New Testament justice. There's Old Testament justice for the guys at the top. Sorry, New Testament justice for the guys at the top. They should be forgiven. You shouldn't punish people. And Old Testament justice for the guys further down the ranks. They will be dealt with and shown no mercy. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, fire and brimstone. And that is the kind of sentiment that has been fueling all of the energy that prosecutors and regulators are put into going after the wrong guys. They think they're punishing something really wrong. But the trouble is, there's supposed to be checks against you thinking that something's wrong when it isn't, when a case is completely misconceived, when that bottle of Bollinger was made up, when that joke about being in a book sometime is just a silly joke. And when Peter Johnson is adjusting it by 1/100th of a percentage point, less than a 50th of what he was asked to adjust following pressure from the UK government and the Bank of England. And yet he's pleading guilty to that, and Stelios is being prosecuted for it, and the Crown thinks it's its best piece of evidence. And as Stelios said, they're leaving out all the stuff, the great big elephant in the room called lowballing, which was the reason they launched their investigation in the first place. It was the deal of tape that led the US to launch criminal investigations in the first place. And if they hadn't said all this trader requests were illegal, then the SFO would never have reversed its decision to prosecute the traders. And there would never have been the 9 criminal trials on both sides of the Atlantic that have destroyed Stelios's life, Matt Connolly's life, Tom Hayes's life, Peter Johnson's life. It's so ironic that Peter Johnson he said to me the other day, we've done an interview which is going to go out on Saturday. So you heard it here first, interview for the BBC and the Times, which will go out on Saturday. And it was very moving. He was in tears recalling how he told his father about the whole thing. He said something similar in the meeting, the very moving meeting last week. And while my brain travels in that direction, I just want to say, I mean, that was one of the most astonishing occasions in my career, being at that meeting. I did this gimmick where I said to the traders, I'd like you to stand up at some point when I've laid out the story. I probably talked for a bit too long, about 25 minutes, half an hour. I'm like Stelios, I could talk forever about this. But I said, could anybody who's been falsely prosecuted for manipulating interest rates make themselves known to the room and stand up? 5 people stood up and the whole room burst into applause. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone who was there. It was a very moving moment. And then, especially after Peter Johnson spoke, fighting back the tears, just about able to complete what he wanted to say. still got his moral compass, you know, after being put through jail and everything, still has an ardent attachment to honesty, which is what led him to kick up the stink about LIBOR in the first place. But he said in our interview, sometimes I wish I hadn't, because I think all this would never happen if I hadn't kicked up a stink in the first place. When you look at the tapes, and then you think about the investigators listening to those tapes, you realize that they picked up the whole idea that it's terribly wrong and corrupt for a derivatives trader to ask a cash trader to put in the LIBOR rate in the commercial interests of the bank. They picked up that very idea from Peter Johnson and Colin Birmingham when they were trying to work out why LIBORs were really false in the credit crunch. But actually, they then took that, because they didn't want to pursue lowballing to the top. They took that critique of LIBOR in the credit crunch and misapplied it to LIBOR before the credit crunch, not realizing the fundamental difference that before the credit crunch, LIBOR was about adjustments within a range of rates offered on the market. Right, Stelios?
Absolutely, a
Right,
range
right.
of true values. Yeah.
Of 1 or 2 hundredths of a percentage point. Whereas with lowballing, they were way out. They were nowhere near where cash was trading, sometimes at the orders of the Bank of England and the government, 60, 70, 80, 100 basis points below where it was trading. So Philippe Moriousuf said to me, he was very upset when the Serious Fraud Office dropped its inquiry into lowballing, because that was the real manipulation, according to him. That was the real manipulation. What traders could have achieved, it was established at trial, was a maximum of 1/8 of a basis point, 0.00125%, I think it is. And that is the most they could have achieved in a shift in the LIBOR average, whereas the Bank of England, the BBA, coordinating banks to do it together were able to move LIBOR by a lot more, and yet they were still doing it for commercial reasons. And here's the irony: the law that was used to prosecute Matt, as well as Stelios — Matt was in the States, Stelios was in the UK, and Peter Johnson and everyone else, was based on a ruling made before the Hayes trial that said any commercial influence on LIBOR made it unlawful. And the Alice in Wonderland thing about that is that every LIBOR, every day, was commercially influenced. They were all like 3 or 4 basis points above the rates where cash was actually offered, in order to build in a bit of profit for the cash desk, lending on money to the rest of the bank. And so you have this Alice in Wonderland scenario where we are retrospectively outlawing everybody and everything to do with LIBOR, really, every day, yet we only pick on a few people. And what determines who is picked? This is the really unsettling part. It's collaboration. It's you could call it collusion, you could call it collaboration, you could call it conspiracy, or you could call it cooperation, which is the official name for it, where the bank's lawyers, in order to achieve a discount on the fines from the regulators, do the regulators work for them, and the prosecutors work for them. And in Matt Connolly's case, one of the most disturbing things is a document where Deutsche Bank is arguing for a massive discount, and it gets it, £800 million for all the work it's done for the US Department of Justice. It gets that $800 million, dollars off its fine, on the basis that it's done loads. And then it turns out that they've had like 30 in-person meetings, hundreds of phone calls, thousands of emails over, I think, what was it, Matt? Was it about 6-7 years before they actually targeted him and decided to prosecute Matt? Where one of the ideas, sorry?
6 years, yeah.
6 years.
At least.
6 years, the DOJ and Paul Weiss, the lawyers for Deutsche Bank, were, and I think it was Sullivan and Cromwell, wasn't it? No, Clifford Chance in the UK. They were all in contact with each other lots, taking lots of money. So the banks are financing it. They're spending like $100 million, I think. But in case of Deutsche Bank paying Paul Weiss, Barclays spent 100 million quid. They're spending these huge amounts of money because they know that the end result, their lawyers will fix it, so that the senior guys will get off, the lawyers won't be implicated, and it'll be someone down the ranks that pays the price and is thrown under the bus. And there will have been evil meetings, and I think this will end up being in a drama, where banks' general counsels, I could name them, but I'm not going to do that here, get together with prosecutors or regulators and hand them the evidence. There, that's the guy you should throw under the bus. Here's the evidence with which to do so. And then it becomes even more unsettling when you think about who they chose and who ended up on trial. because of the way plea bargaining works in the States and the pressure they put people under, you've got to really care about honesty, almost to the point of recklessness, in order not to plead guilty. Matt Connolly is the one among those elite few who care so much about honesty, and another is Tony Conti, that they turn around and say to the DOJ, sorry, no, I'm not going to sign up to this bullshit. I didn't think it was wrong back then. You want me to say it's wrong? Well, Mike Kirtler did. He caved to the pressure. He was threatened with a 12-year sentence, and he could have got 2 with cooperation suspended. So, of course, you follow this great big carrot and stick approach. If you're Kirtler and you don't care as much about honesty as Matt does, then you say, okay, fair enough, I'll plead guilty. And I've spoken to him. He's not particularly proud about what he did, but and he realizes that he's been the focus of wrath for those who are on trial. How could he pretend and lie in order to make false confessions of dishonesty in order to that someone like Matt could be prosecuted? Tony Conti couldn't imagine doing that, so they prosecuted him. And whereas Mike Kirtler, by contrast, just decided it was a calculation. He did a trader's calculation. He said, okay, costs and benefits, risks. And he thought, okay, well, I keep my house. I got a criminal conviction, but at least I keep my house. At least I won't be ruined by legal fees trying to defend myself in the United States. And so Mike Kirtler pleaded guilty. But now the US courts, you see, have said the whole case was misconceived. And the US Department of Justice, saying it was illegal 11 years ago, has now changed its mind and applied to the courts for Mike Kirtler's conviction and those of the others who made false confessions of dishonesty to be overturned. No consequences for them. No consequences for Tim Parietti, who made a false confession of dishonesty and pleaded guilty and testified against Matt in his trial. The DOJ, read chapter 16, astonishingly, this was established in court, did a side deal with Tim Parietti in order that he could keep $9 million. So it so happened that the period of time, the indictment period that they wanted him to confess to was between, I think it was between 2005 and 2008. They needed, he was prepared to confess to, but the prosecuting team thought the indictment period went on till 2010, so they couldn't have him say confess to a period up to 2008, and they had to have him say instead a period of at least 2008 to at least 2008. So that was all he was being punished for, 2005 to 2008, but he was testifying to a longer period, 2008 to 2010. Why? Because that was the way that the DOJ could let him keep his $9 million and still say what they wanted him to say, so they could prosecute Matt Connolly over 3 emails from 12 years before, from which he couldn't have made any money. This is why the word incredible is on the front of the book. You know, when you think about these things, when you think about the fact that the DOJ has now accepted that this was not illegal, and then you reflect back on the fact that 11 years ago, there was a huge fuss in Parliament condemning 14 unnamed traders at Barclays for what Ed Miliband said were atrocious acts, for what Clive Efford MP said was treason, for what Andrea Leadsom, not knowing any law or statute, said in Parliament was criminality. And it's really, you know, it's interesting because, you know, my boss gets nervous when I talk about this because I'm passionate about it. He wants to make sure I maintain due BBC impartiality. Okay, so I have to put in balancing comments. We've gone to the DOJ and they have refused to comment. Others declined to comment. Barclays declined to comment. Deutsche declined to comment. They all declined to comment because they don't really know what to say. But I sort of, you do your partiality by talking about that. But actually the whole exercise was an exercise in impartiality in the first place. So everybody in 2012 was condemning unnamed traders. They happened to be Stelios, they happened to be Peter Johnson. They were unnamed because it could prejudice a trial. And if they had named Stelios or Peter Johnson or any of the others, then they would have had a case, Stelios's lawyers, tell me if I'm wrong, to say, no, they've created prejudice against us and get the trial thrown out. Is that right, Stelios?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. So they didn't name Stelios, they didn't name Peter Johnson, they didn't name the others. And I'm going to shut up in a minute because I think there are other people on this call more interesting, but they didn't name them because if they had, it would have created prejudice. So we in the media, but what that meant in terms of defamation, we could also freely condemn because we were not bound to go to someone and ask for a right of reply out of impartiality. But I started thinking, hang on, these people are really being condemned. Atrocious acts, treason by MPs. No one knew who they were. Don't they have a voice? Shouldn't we ask them what they have to say about it? So it's actually pursuing impartiality that led me to this story and led me to try to get the defendants to overcome their natural distrust of the media and talk to me. And fortunately, Stelios was one of the guys who steeled himself after being vilified in the media, unnamed, for an imaginary bottle of Bollinger, to talk to me, and did so, and gave us a great interview for Panorama 2017, which I'll always cherish and always remember. You know, I mean, I say in the thanks to my book, this is wrapping up. Thanks to all those who took a stand for honesty. Let's use Stelios, because you came out when you said on that Panorama everything you just said, completely honest as a die. That's Tony Conti. I don't know if he's here, but for refusing to testify against someone, even though it's meant he was criminally prosecuted in the United States and his life has been wrecked. It's Peter Johnson, who was the original whistleblower who cared about honesty when no one else did. And it's Matt Connolly, who's just pig-headed enough to refuse, no matter what the incentives are, to say some bullshit to please some prosecutor. So I want to pay tribute to all the defendant traders for their honesty. And I want to underline that this whole exercise is an exercise in impartiality.
Andy, for the record, my legal team advised me not to do the Panorama. I said, I don't care what you say, I'm doing it.
I'll get the lawyers. Just joking.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Andy, there's a Mark Twain quote that I think is rather fitting for you, sir. The quote is, the two most important days in a man's life are, number one, the day he's born, and number two, the day he finds out why. And it may well be, sir, that the day that you publish this is why you might be here, right? It might be why you're here. Can we please put our hands together again to show our appreciation to Andy Verity? Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, gents. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very briefly, we joke about nominative determinism. I was blessed with this like slightly burdensome name, Verity, where maybe most journalists should be called mendacity instead. And I've always wanted to try to live up to that name, and occasionally in this job you can. And yes, I think I've always been a little bit that annoying kid at the back of the class at school who persisted with the teacher asking why until he understood. And that sort of dubious skill is what comes to the fore in this whole episode. So thank you very much for your kind words, Andy. I want to hear from everybody else now.
We will be. We will be. But you didn't mention Carlo, but I know Carlo's on that list of traders that you are referring to.
Yeah, straight as a die, completely honest.
Yeah, absolutely. We got various folk who want to come in. Could I please ask everybody to please be as succinct as possible, because there's so many people, which is great. So many people that want to chip in. Paul, I love you. Go for it.
You said that just because you saw my hand up, didn't you?
Go on.
Right, I talking about names, two of the key lawyers at Lloyd's involved in various things, HBOS Reading and everything else. One's called, one's surname's Cheetham, the other one's called LaHood. You know, rather speaks volumes and appropriate. I'd like to ask Andy, like, if you could pick the worst example of misconduct, malfeasance, or corruption or whatever in the entire book, what would it be?
Such a hard one. That's such a hard one. But there is probably an answer. Can I ever think about that one and come back to you later?
Yeah.
After you consulted with the lawyers, Andy. And meanwhile, we'll go to Nicholas Wilson. Thanks for the question, Paul. It's a good question. Mr. Wilson, by the way, for those of you that don't know, talking about people to really admire, Nicholas battled single-handedly to get, I think it was it 2 million or 20 million pounds of the compensation
200
for other people after having been wrecked by HSBC. Please check out Nicholas's website. I'll put a link in the chat in a minute. Meanwhile, Nicholas, please share your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. You're always very kind to me. It was 200 million, actually. And Andy Verity, thank you for everything you're doing. You might not be at liberty to answer this, but did you get any help from anybody at the FCA? And in other words, do you have any friendly contacts?
I talked to, no, not in this. I've talked to ex-FCA people in other contexts, but no.
No, all right. Thank
No,
you.
I did talk to some former SFO insiders, but no, I didn't get any help. In fact, I got a lot of hostility from the FCA.
Yeah.
They got quite angry, and Margaret Cole, who's named in it. I did speak to Hector Sands, who used to be the boss of the FSA, and I went to see him actually, and we talked about it. He didn't like what I was doing. He did point out a few interesting things, which I probably can't tell you yet because I haven't substantiated them. But that's the answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Andy. Mr. Anthony Stansfeld, for those of you that don't know, Anthony was the Police Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley. It was because of Andy and others that various bad bankers got locked up that needed to get locked up and should have got locked up. And he was also the national lead for fraud for the Police Commission. Anthony Stansfeld, thank you.
Yes, Andy, I mean, a great book. I hope you're going to follow it up with another one about the banking frauds, where literally thousands of companies had been taken down, any number of suicides, literally thousands of people ruined, and one or two people ended up in jail on absolutely very like in your case. But the banking frauds, you know, the amount of money and the damage to people has been absolutely huge. And if you do get round to doing that book, I have all my correspondence with people who did absolutely nothing about it, notably Andrew Bailey, when he ran the Financial Conduct Authority, who I had meetings with, and I had my correspondence with him. It went right up to the Home Secretary, who was well informed, the then Home Secretary, of what was going on. I briefed Lynn Owens, who ran the NCA, and I briefed the number 2, who's now running it, Graham Bigger. They were given a vast amount of evidence and did absolutely precisely nothing with it other than cover it up. And the problem we have, like you found with libel, is that the revolving door with the people who've committed the crimes and the regulatory authorities. And the regulatory authorities who should be sorting this out are doing nothing about it. There's one hell of a story there, and it's a big one. Thank you.
Yeah. Could I respond, Andy? Are you okay? Yeah. So as you know, I've admired your campaigning on this, Anthony, and I've also taken quite a close interest in the mistreatment of small and medium-sized businesses. In fact, it was getting to know context in that context. An earlier panorama I did called "Did the Bank Wreck My Business?" I wanted to call it "The Bank Stole My Business," but the lawyers wouldn't let me. In that context, back in 2014, I made a bunch of contacts, and it's that led me onto LIBOR and led me to find evidence and stuff about LIBOR, which showed that it was pointing to the top. I was going to the trials at the same time, but I was also quite preoccupied still with the mistreatment of small businesses and the complete failure of accountability about that, because that too was ordered from the top. And, and what we know is there's evidence pointing to the government about that. I've got a few stories to tell about that, but ones that probably shouldn't be in a public forum. It's also went to the top because the same elite, the very powerful, influential people at the top of the Treasury and the Bank of England. I don't know if judges were involved in that one, but senior civil servants who often mix at Buckingham Palace's receptions with the wealthy people and influential business people. They meet in lots of other contexts, including things like various forums which are designed to achieve positive outcomes and are often about positive things, but they all know each other and meet each other, and they meet in the clubs as well, of course. That old boys' school thing, you're not part of it, Anthony, somehow, but I mean, in a way culturally you would be suitable. I'm sure you're entirely clubbable.
They haven't had a go at me yet, but I mean, the one burning question behind it is, why does every major fraud, and there are thousands of them, end up as a civil matter in a civil court in front of certain judges who, most of them, work for the very people, the legal practices that are defending the banks on this thing? It absolutely stinks. I mean, there was one recent case where a fraud case went through a criminal court, and the judge said, why on earth has this had to be privately prosecuted?
Yes.
No police force would take it on. And why is fraud now considered a civil matter? And that it's the ability to put it through civil courts, when if it was in front of a jury, it would be clear.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with any of that, Anthony, and I also understand your indignation against it, because you've seen what happens to the victims and tried to take up the cudgels for them, and I respect that. As a little anecdote, because I wouldn't disagree with really much of what you said, but from my own personal point of view, I was once in front of one of those senior judges, Lord Chief Justice John Thomas, who's at the centre of the story. I'll give you a little clue. The chapter titled "The Ringmaster." The ringmaster ain't Tom Hayes. I won't say who it is. But anyway, I was in front of Lord Chief Justice John Thomas, and he was presiding over the appeal of J. Merchant and John Matthew, and I was cross because they prevented me from. I may have told you this in the previous forum actually, but I was cross because we'd gone along, journalists, to try to report the hearing, and it was important to the panorama I was making at the time, and I was clattering away on my typewriter, and John Thomas suddenly looks up and says, "There are reporting restrictions." And I thought, well, why is that? Why are there reporting restrictions? They normally have a sign on the door. They didn't have a sign on the door. So when I questioned this at lunchtime to the court clerk, he said, well, you can make an application. I said, what's that? And he said, you can stand up and give your reasons. So I stood up in front of John Thomas, slightly bewildered, wishing I'd been wearing a suit. And he came back in and said, right, Mr. Verity. And I said, well, I think the problem here, because I steeped in all the SME misconduct, is that the real frauds, like, for example, banks asset stripping small businesses, are left unpursued. But the fraud we are pursuing here, at least, is arguably not a fraud at all. And there's some concern that the understanding of city practices is light, and that actually so the whole process is politicized. And I'd already seen as well trails of evidence pointing to the top. And I think, unfortunately, it's very similar. We see it here, and in fact, anthropologists like David Graeber have traced this back. It goes right back to Assyrian times. Communism of the rich, he calls it. Like where the elite protects itself. I think, unfortunately, an unnatural tendency in a lot of societies, I would contend, and this is taking a big thought, is for the elite to acquire wealth and power, and then to protect itself and just sort of do what's necessary to appease the wider population, but not much more. And I think when we were younger, after World War II, we were in an exceptional time there, which, we grew up taking for granted that things would progress, that things would get more equal, that people would get better off each year, and that the past of aristocracies and the elite, which sort of seemed to form itself, that caused the French Revolution, that caused the Russian Revolution, because they were so rotten. Well, that was the past. We weren't like that anymore, because things were a lot more equal. And there was a great uprising from poverty post World War II. There was a lot more equality. And so I think that what we are seeing illustrations of, both through your campaigning, Anthony, and through this story, is unfortunately a ghastly illustration of a sort of underlying phenomena that's maybe always at work, but we rarely get sight of unless we burrow really hard, like Anthony has or like I have. Namely, that you tend to get the creation throughout history of an elite that protects itself. And in order to have democracy and for it to really be meaningful, well, they had to fight. We only got universal suffrage 100 years ago. We can't take it for granted. You've got to fight to have democracy, and you've got to constantly reinforce principles like equality before the law, or that Parliament shouldn't be misled.
One of the problems is the police don't understand money laundering. The banks do. If you get £20,000 into your bank account, they're very quick to ask you where it came from and can you identify this and that. But for banks to move 100 million to Jersey or the Virgin Islands is just a matter of switching it between 2 or 3 different bank sort codes, and away it goes. And the police haven't a clue, and nobody from the FCA or anybody else looks into it. So money can be moved enormously quickly by the banks. You and I can't move money at all. And that's
another investigation, Anthony, and we're actually working on something on that, about how money is being moved in spite of sanctions, which I hope to come to fruition in the next few months.
Good, thank you.
Anthony, thank you. Andy, thank you. Mr. Mike Lloyd, after Mike's point or question or comment, we're going to hear from Carlo, one of the other innocent traders who ended up in jail. Mike Lloyd.
Good evening, Andy. You've made a great job of exposing the collusion between the banks and the establishment in respect to the LIBOR scandal and the consequences that have been suffered by the victims here. In view of the past and your involvement in the Panorama program titled "Did the Bank Wreck My Business?", have you thought about doing a book on the similar collusion between the banks and the establishment regarding the mis-selling of IRHPs, hidden credit lines, and the nonsense of sophistication criteria that was retrospectively applied to companies who were excluded, in my case 7 years after the product was made the term of my borrowings. So we get sophistication criteria, and then we get the nonsense of the BBRS, which was some 3 years to get there. And yet again, I get excluded because my balance sheet is in excess of 5 million gross. When does a bank ever use gross as a calculation?
Thanks, Mike.
Shall I answer briefly? I'll just be quite
Yes,
brief.
please. Thank you.
I've had a lot of dealings with James Hurley because the Times serialized my book, and also from before when we've been pursuing the same sort of trails, because he talks to businesses a lot. And the difference between James and other financial journalists, banking correspondents, for example, his contacts are actual businesses. He was enterprise editor for ages. He talks to people on the ground actually running businesses, whereas a lot of financial journalists, they just talk to the banks and their press offices, and then they're wined and dine. They are what I call embedded. So James and I have got what a sort of interesting angle that other journalists don't have, which meant that we ended up talking to businesses and their lawyers and various other things up against the banks. And that's where I found that's where my adventure started. Mark Bishop set me off on this road, but I've always felt, and I continue to feel, and so does James, that we should do something on this, whether it's a book or a podcast series or something else. It continues to haunt us. And it's one of those things where, just like LIBOR, if I end my career not having done anything about it, I will feel, oh, I should have done something about that. You know, so the answer is yes, I have thought about that, Mike.
Thank you, Andy. Mike, we're now going to hear from Carlo Colombo. Carlo, over to you, sir. And thank you very much for sharing what you're about to say. Thank you, Carlo.
Well, thank you very much. And then again, thanks to Andy hugely for all that he's done. I'm going to be brief, and I'm not entirely sure what sort of, I mean, I could talk about these things for ages and ages, obviously, but if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask. I mean, to me, like, the main point that I want to say is connecting to what Andy was just saying. People have a general view that we live in a society that it's more or less, where things more or less work, where justice more or less works, where there is a more or less just system. And for me, like, of all the many ways in which this whole thing has completely destroyed my life, I feel possibly the most significant is the way in which there's been a complete breakdown in my relationship to the world, in my trust in the world I exist in, and also in my relationship with other people, insofar as most people in our society do believe in the justice system. They do believe to some extent in institutions. And the problem with what's happened is that it's really hard to go around and say, I went to prison, but I did absolutely nothing wrong. And the matter is too technical for you to actually be able to explain to people that you're completely innocent. They will always say, well, you must have done something wrong. A little bit, something wrong. You must have done a little bit wrong. And that makes life really hard at all levels, like from the very fact of, trying to go to the bank to speak to something, or trying to get insurance, to speaking to normal people that you meet. How can you relate to anyone if they all immediately think, oh, you're kind of a little bit of a criminal, a little bit dodgy, just kind of halfway dodgy. So then the other, the related problem is that in talking about these things, right, a lot of the conversation seems to be, let's find the real guilty people and lock them up. And and my concern here is that people are always very, very ready to, I mean, people are, always angry for all sorts of reasons. And they're always, rightly usually, and they're always trying to find someone to use as a scapegoat or to use as anything, as the guilty one or the criminal or whatever. And my worry is that the kind of the process that happens there is the same that ended up with putting us in prison. See, people are angry. You need to find someone guilty. You find someone, you put it in prison.
Yes.
And I mean, of course, there are loads of people. Like I'll talk about my own case. There are loads of people that did really nasty things, and I don't know exactly who and how. I mean, I got some ideas, but I mean, I don't think the solution in our case is I should find these people and put them in prison, because I think it's a much more social and systemic problem. It's the sort of stuff that Matt was talking about at the beginning. Is the fact that we live in a society where everyone is absolutely prepared to, do something that's not quite right or a little bit dodgy to protect themselves. And when this builds up on a level of a society, you end up in a situation where every tool of power becomes misused. And every feeling of anger, whenever it arises, if it's on a powerful enough level, can give rise to things like what happened to us. So, I mean, all of this just to say that what I would like is to kind of, in a sense, to let me put it this way, I don't want more people to be in prison. I don't want the bosses of banks to go to prison, because I don't think that would solve absolutely anything. It would just create more anger, more violence, more state violence. It would create more, it would just make things worse. Same as people calling for, harsher sentences.
So how do you hold them accountable, Carlo?
I don't know, but I'm really concerned that, I mean, people who did things that are objectively wrong should be punished, absolutely, and should be held accountable. But my concern is that the focus of those kind of these kind of things. I mean, my concern is that if we just say these people, I mean, the problem is these people will never go to prison to start with, realistically, because this is the world we live in. Like, I cannot possibly imagine my judge being sent to prison for having helped the prosecutor. It's just not going to happen. So my concern is that calling for more and more, let's send the bosses to prison. The only thing that can result is our conviction not be overturned, because it feeds into an idea of everyone was guilty.
Carlo, what's shining through for me, listening to you talk today and also last week in Parliament, is your sense of balance and proportionality and wisdom, and an ability to try to understand the systemic issues that have happened here. It's so obvious that you're the kind of person that you are, and you're the kind of person that should never have been put to jail. You often leave me quite speechless, Carlo. You really do. You often leave me quite speechless, as you
and
you have done.
Carlo, as well, can I say, a man not only honest but so candid that you are willing to share even how it's affected you in the family way, with members of your family applying the logic that you were just describing when they think, no smoke without fire. We were all touched when you shared that with us, and I think in a way, isn't that part of the answer? The atmosphere in Parliament where people's heart went out because people were open and honest and sharing. It's part of your transparency theme. If it's people's tendency to condemn before they understand, and the same neural circuitry, the Old Testament punishment, stoning someone, neural circuitry that's active here, well, then the answer is perhaps a bit of New Testament approach, forgiveness and redemption, but also understanding the problem that's there, because the original injustice that's really being punished by the juries in the libel trials isn't somebody fiddling with an interest rate. It's grotesque economic injustice. You know, Carlo, you were paid millions once. I'm sure you acknowledge this. You know, and Tom Hayes got an astronomical salary. And he would acknowledge this too, that the prosecutors were very easily able to animate the juries, or to create an animus in the juries against the traders by simply mentioning their pay. They didn't mention, as Jay Merchant has objected, the much more astronomical pay of the bosses who lined up in the prosecution witness box to condemn them by saying things that, well, certainly the US courts no longer agree with. And you know, there's a real element of old-fashioned religion, which was in a way designed to address the same old problems. The conceit of progress blinds us to how similar we are to people in the past who were stoning people. You know, we are similar. We're the same human beings. We've got the same brain circuitry. And I agree with Carlo, and I say this in the epilogue. If our instinctual response to our indignation, whether it's about the banking crisis or whatever else, is to want to jail someone, we've got to be careful, because we're no different to those people who just wanted to stone someone when they got angry. We need to be better than that.
And it doesn't matter who we stone. We just need to stone someone.
Say again?
It doesn't matter who. We just need anyone.
Somebody needs to be stoned. Yeah. Andy and Carlo, this exchange of ideas is reminding me of something Mark Bishop speaks about, relating to the way that Nelson Mandela organized those truth and reconciliation exercises as a way to try to heal the hurt in South Africa. This is a very thought-provoking conversation. Can we please show our appreciation to Carlo for sharing his thoughts with us today? We're then going to go to, thank you, Carlo. Thank you very, very much. We're going to go to Mark Bishop for his point, then to Nick Rogers, and then we're going to be going to Paul Carlo, who's going to make a point and also share some other thoughts as well. Mr. Mark Bishop, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. And the area that I'd like to talk about follows on very nicely or neatly from what Carlo has been speaking about. And it's this. It seems to me that there are three ways that you can respond to what's happened. The first is a kind of Old Testament way, let's just throw a stone, let's stone them. The second is a New Testament way, which is let's forgive them. And the third one is a kind of what's known as a utilitarian view of morality ethics, which is to say, how can we deter them and others from doing the same thing in the future? I personally don't support the New Testament approach, because I think that they'll pretend that they're sorry and just keep doing it. And other people like them who follow after them in similar roles will be emboldened, actually, because they'll say, yeah, if you say you're sorry and you make the appropriate noises, you can just keep going business as usual. And we saw, of course, what happened with the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards. That got turned into something else. I can't remember its name, but it was then no longer parliamentary. It was operated by UK Finance. And recently UK Finance said, well, we've no longer got a budget for it. It will stop. But UK Finance still has a budget to hire the best lobbyists in the country. So UK Finance has the money. It chooses no longer to signal virtue by running something that talks about ethics. And that tells you something, I think. So my view is that one should take a utilitarian view and say, how can we stop this happening again? And that's why I think it's interesting. Andy said, there could be a route forward to do with truth and reconciliation. One option might be to write to, for example, the Chancellor and say to him, this is what has happened. Here is the book. There are two ways this can run. One way is, of course, Tom's conviction and all any other convictions that still stand must be overturned. They must be compensated. People who did bad things, whether those bad things are the scapegoating and conviction, attempted conviction of the innocent over libel submission, or the actual lowballing, the genuine manipulation of libel, those people will leave the industries that they're in and they will never return. And that applies to bankers, lawyers, regulators, treasury officials, just bidden a lot of them. And that's option one. That's the kind of, the route that is about non-conflict, it's forgiveness, but it still sends out a message to others. The alternative is it's going to have to be unpleasant. And if somebody were to write that to the Chancellor, so he knows what the game is, who knows, they might do the right thing. If they don't do the right thing, then it's going to have to be unpleasant. But at least there is no suggestion in that case it's being done out of, bitterness, anger, retribution or anything like that. It's simply because you've got to prevent it from happening again. And you really have got to, because, it's not going to happen again to the people who have been convicted, but it is going to happen to other people if nothing's done about it. And then that kind of brings on the question of what can be done about it. And it seems to me this is a kind of 2x2 matrix. Forgive me trying to turn this into a consultancy exercise, but there's 2x2 matrix where on one axis you've got the actual lowballing of libel versus the conviction of people for submission of libels, and on the other index you've got the civil matters and the criminal matters. So there are 4 routes that you could pursue, and it seems to me those things should be pursued. So in terms of the traders, you have suffered mightily, emotionally and financially, and I believe that you are due redress. Now, one of the options which Andy and I have been discussing just today with solicitors that we trust very much is that actually an employer who fits up their employee by carrying out a fake investigation, submitting the document, a selective group of documents to prosecutors and regulators while withholding other stuff, those people have very seriously breached their duty of care to their employee, and they are liable for the losses. And those parties are banks with very big balance sheets, so they're definitely good for the money, and the traders earned a lot of money, so a lifetime's income basically deprived of a trader is a very large sum, large enough to make it worth lawyers going after. So personally I would go after that. The consequence of that, by the way, of course, is that shareholders will get poorer. The shareholders are innocent parties in this. But as a side effect of that, there will be certain law firms that those banks will no longer be able to work with. In fact, they will probably find that they are blackballed by other banks and financial institutions as well. You'll also find that there are individuals within the regulators and prosecutors who unfortunately are unwell and need to leave their careers for personal reasons. It won't be made overt, but there will be people who will suffer consequences. And it's right they suffer consequences, not because they might ever do it again, but because many others around them would, given half a chance. And then as far as the lowballing is concerned, I think what you've got to do is go down the prosecution route. Now, one way of doing that might be to submit a dossier to the SFO in the UK, the DOJ in the US, and say, here is prima facie evidence of manipulation of this index. You guys have already told us that that is an offence. We know when it becomes an offence, which is when it's outside the daily range. So we know that there is an offence there. Please go and prosecute. Oh, and by the way, if you don't prosecute, at least in the UK, misconduct in a public office. So there's a very strong incentive for those individuals to go off and try and prosecute. If they don't prosecute, then go down the misconduct in the public office route with them to encourage them to prosecute. So, I'm personally not in the position of saying, of course, I've got no, in some ways you could say, I've got no horse in this race because I'm not a trader. I've not lost anything personally from this, but I am a citizen. And every citizen is at risk unless things like this are dealt with appropriately. And I would just urge the traders to think and to talk to each other now, a time when you are allowed to talk to each other about how you want this to play out, because it would be a real tragedy if you personally were not put in the financial position you would have been in, but for this, and if there were no lessons learnt by the industry and by statutory bodies that will prevent this from occurring in the future.
Mark, as so often I say to you, thank you so much for such thoughtful points that you make. Andy, would you want to reply to anything that Mark has just spoken about? Any immediate thoughts that come to mind in relation to that?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Mark was saying. I think I wrote the book. I've got a dedication to my 3 daughters in the front, and I basically, what kept me at it was a few things. One is just indignation that the establishment could cover things up like that. 2 is just the sense of injustice on behalf of the traders. But the third is that I don't want my daughters to grow up in a world like that. It's got to be better than this. It's got to be a better way than that power and wealth can manipulate the justice system. I think, first of all, I think it's partly, I do blame it partly on austerity. I wouldn't blame all of it, because David Davis argues with me about this. But if you underfund education, what you get kids who aren't very well educated. If you underfund health, what you get? You get a lot of sickness and unnecessary deaths. If you underfund justice, what you get miscarriages of justice. Of course you do. So fund it properly, and funding it anyway is only a token of the value that a government places on a certain public good. If we care about justice, we fund it properly. A lot of lawyers say the justice system is in a terrible mess, and it would only take 2 or 3 billion to sort it out. And when we talk about billions, everyone goes, "Oh, billions, that's a lot." But actually, the government's budget is about $1 trillion. Not far off $1 trillion. So that's only a couple of thousandths of a percentage point, referring back to LIBOR, of that could sort out justice. So I guess those are my thoughts, and not necessarily directly pertinent to what Mark said, but I do broadly agree with everything.
Thank you. Andy, can I just possibly come in there with an interesting observation that's occurred to me? And it's this. Austerity, one of the things about austerity is it tends to be applied very selectively, I find. There's always money for things that the people in power care about. And a really good example of that is I'm right in thinking Deutsche Bank got a discount, was it 800 million off their fine for cooperation? So they had to spend a large amount of money with the lawyers in order to cook up the narrative that kept their senior people out of court, but they got a very big discount for it. And of course, they were spending at a prodigious rate because they had, very expensive lawyers doing this. If regulators had been investigating, those regulators are paid a fraction of the amount of money. They could have investigated the whole thing instead of just fitting up, a few individuals for less money. So we could actually have got to the right place if we'd have needed to. And for example, the Financial Conduct Authority will often say, we have a limited budget, we need to prioritize. It's actually a lie. They have an unlimited budget and they don't need to prioritize. The reason is that they have a remarkable right, I don't think belongs to any other organization in the UK, and that is they can set their budget wherever they want. Whatever they set it at, they can then demand that sum of money from the industry in the way of a levy. So they could choose to set it at a higher level if they wanted to. It is a political choice that they keep it where it is.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark. We're going to go to Nick Rogers. Nick, please share your thought. Thank you. You'll need to take yourself off mute, please. Thank you, Nick.
Right. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Andrew Verity extremely warmly for all the work that he's doing. I just wish I was so eloquent. I don't know Andy personally, but I used to be a photographer in journalism, and I'm more comfortable behind a camera than I am talking in front of it. So it's so nice to see someone who's so eloquent and enthusiastic about the corruption, or trying to deal with the corruption that's been going on. Now, you will appreciate, as perhaps I was behind the camera on many of these occasions, but you'll appreciate that you're in a unique position to ask people in power the questions that people like us, who are now retired or whatever, have been wanting to ask, but not been, or been trying to ask, but not been able to get any substantial replies. Now, can you, in your dealings in the financial sphere, have you received any guidance or information to let us know that there's substantial movements to try in the background, behind the scenes, to try to tackle the horrendous damage, lies, deceit, which has become manifest within the establishment, regulators such as the FCA, FOS, BBRS, City of London Police, Action Fraud, Andrew Bailey, the Governor of the Bank of England. I mean, they're all in it together, it seems to me. And they're acting as such a cartel that it's very difficult to break into it. And unless there's somebody like yourself who has access to, well, writing an excellent book, but the Panorama program, for example, I mean, that is such a powerful position to be in. I mean, there used to be the Sunday Times who broke the story about the banks overcharging. This is 15 years ago. And that started me off on all this palaver. Now, I'll keep it short, but we were still awaiting this long delayed and postponed Linda Dobbs report into Lloyds Bank. The BBRS, which was set up at great expense and fanfare, has become an unmitigated failure, totally unfit for purpose. And since then, okay, Boris is gone. Sunak is now trying to get to grips with all the problems that he caused. But Kevin Hollenrake, who was doing a lot of good in the APPG select committees, is now Under Secretary of State, Department for Business and Trade. Do you get any feeling that there's perhaps some movement to try to tackle what is obviously such a serious, major problem?
Thank you, Nick. Andy.
What the whole BSU business and stuff like that? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've been looking into that one for so many years. I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say yes. But unfortunately, I think the frank answer has been no. I think, the Turners and everyone, and finally, I remember Philip Hammond saying, I think he was the one who gave the nod to them to do something about it, which led to the BBRS. And then when it just gets watered down, just like the IRHP compensation scheme, by bank lobbying. And this is part of the problem. It's all about who you're talking to. So, we were not being impartial in 2012 when everyone was allowed to condemn traders' conduct without anyone hearing the traders' side of the story. So I went and got the traders' side of the story, and boy, do they have a story to tell. I was the only one who did that. So I was, in a way, the only one doing what journalists are always supposed to do, namely going, and I don't want to be righteous about that, but it shows you what you can turn up when you just do something other people don't do, when you sort of depart from convention a little bit. Unfortunately, in the conventional society we live in, you get these ossified structures where people talk to the same people around them, and only a few people. And the world beyond that is just other people. And I think that's part of the problem. When you start having conversations, and Davis makes common cause with John McDonnell, even though they're so politically different. And that's because they both care about justice and they both care about democracy. That's the sort of thing that needs to happen. People come out of their silos and talk to each other, I think. And we'll find that there is a huge consensus for all the things that people on this forum care about. It's not anything particularly that you wouldn't teach your kids, is it? It's just like, we care about honesty, we care about justice, and we don't think power and wealth should be able to manipulate justice or deny people justice, such as those who've been horribly traduced in the turnaround con, as I call it, banks pretending to turn you around when they're not, or missold IRHPs, etc. The word mis-selling, that's an outcome of lobbying. What are you actually talking about? You're talking about someone being sold something, missold it means, well, it's kind of like fraud in a way, isn't it? Someone said something and they misrepresented it, and they didn't actually, but the trouble with fraud is it's hard to prove honesty, so we're saying mis-selling instead. So, I don't know if the law sets too high a bar to prove what we all know to be the case, but it's the lobbying for me that is a big part of the problem here. And when you get things like a Goldman Sachs guy who's in 10 Downing Street, and then his former boss at Goldman Sachs gives an 800 grand loan to a former prime minister, and that boss gets given the chairmanship of the BBC, that's when I start to feel a little bit nauseous. I was very happy when Richard Sharp left the BBC, because it's, for all its faults, Auntie Beeb is a cherished institution, and you can see how it's still capable of doing stuff, properly independent stuff. This thing here, this is, I'm not a massive George Orwell fan, but I read 1984. If liberty, this is inscribed outside the BBC, so I'm safe to say it. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. He worked for the BBC, and freedom of the press, democracy. If you're just saying stuff that the big commercial enterprises want you to say, you're just doing advertising, you know.
Yeah.
But if you're saying stuff that big commercial enterprises might go to the lawyers about, well, don't stop because you're worried, like a lot of people, frankly, at the BBC and in the media would. Someone might sue. Better not do that. I might lose my job. No, come on. What is your job? What is your job? Why are you here? Why are you here, judges? Was it justice you're supposed to be after? Why are you here, bankers? Isn't it supporting the economy and businesses you're supposed to be here for? If you're not doing your job, that's low-level corruption. That's our particularly British form of corruption, where we don't actually do the original job. And people like me who are going to take things a bit literally, maybe a bit naively, say, "Oh, I'm a journalist. I'm supposed to expose things," you know, even if it annoys someone. We are actually, in a way, just trying to reinvigorate sort of cranky, old, poorly oiled machinery of democracy that was fought for and established by our ancestors. Yeah. And we need to do them credit for the fight that they staged to get democracy, to get universal suffrage, to actually, you know, make democracy work, you know, as we all grew up believing it should.
Thank you, Andy, very, very much indeed. Thank you. We're covering such interesting ground tonight, really rich, thought-provoking stuff. The debate has matured and developed and moved forward. It's really interesting. Mr. Paul Carlier, thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I want to touch on what Carlo said earlier, and it's the do people deserve to go to jail for what was done to him and others? And there's this perception that to seek justice or to seek others to do jail time for what they did is almost distasteful, or it's all revenge, or that's not But unfortunately, what we have here is a situation where, and I've been a victim of this myself in a different extent, and PJ is probably the perfect example. They threatened him with 15 years in prison. They threatened him with a multi-million-pound fine. And what that has the effect of doing is making it look like, all right, a 2-year sentence and a 100 grand fine. Oh, I've had a touch there. And then you ignore the fact that that's a travesty in and of itself. So, they ramp up the leverage against you to the point where you're actually almost accepting of, oh, well, okay, that would do. And I think the problem—
That's it, Paul. I know you're normally not the easiest person to interrupt, but I enjoy listening to you. But in PJ's case, there's one particular thing that happened, which I think is probably one of the things which Carlo would have in mind if he wanted something to be punished, which would be this: they cut him off from legal support.
Yeah.
Cut him off from legal support. So why did he plead guilty? I'll tell you why he pleaded guilty. He's told me, and we're putting it in our interview on Saturday. He pleaded guilty because his lawyers went away and they looked at the evidence, and it seemed like, based on the law at the time and what the kind of general thing was, that the evidence which appeared to be there, the law said this was wrong. It was more than 50% likely to be convicted, even though the law we now know was, according to the American courts, misconceived. Yeah. But he told me that he faced this dilemma, and he discussed it with his wife. Okay, should we, if I don't plead guilty, what happens? If I don't plead guilty, I go into a trial, I'll probably spend best part of £1 million defending myself. Minimum. Yeah, and then if I lose, obviously it's a nightmare, and I'll get maximum sentence. They'll throw the book at me, and I seem to be at the center of this scandal, even though I was the whistleblower. But I'm at the center of this scandal, and it looks like they'll throw the book at me. And if that happens, well, I go to jail and I lose all the money I spent defending myself, and I can't pass that on to my children and grandchildren. Or even if I'm found innocent, I've still blown nearly £1 million on lawyers, and that'll be it. But if I plead guilty, I can go to jail for 2 years and keep the money and have something to pass on to my children and grandchildren. And he knew that he'd probably spend a fair bit of that time in an open prison. Now, is he as guilty as someone like Mike Kirtler, who pleaded guilty? Well, he didn't stand up as a prosecution witness. He didn't give a false confession of dishonesty. I know some of the traders, Carlo, I'd be interested in your view. Did him pleading guilty make it harder for the other traders in that trial? I don't know I know you're in a separate trial, obviously, but did it make it harder for those other people? And he says, well, look, when you're under that much pressure, you can't really think about other people. You just can't think about other people. So anyway, just to sum up that fascinating bit of story from him, it's just they cut him off from legal support. Now, if they funded his legal support, he could have evaluated his decision on whether to plead guilty or not on an honest basis. Okay, I'm not guilty. I'm going to fight this. I don't have to worry about the cost. It was only because he had to worry about the cost and losing his house that he ended up pleading guilty. Now, the system shouldn't be like that, that, pressure of money is used to force you into a corner, but it happens all the time, doesn't it? We know that the lawyers you come up against, Paul, and all the SMEs who've litigated, the lawyers they come up against, they know it really well, don't they? Every means they can of using cost pressure to crush your claim. Yeah,
exactly. And just on that point, Barclays later did the same to Chris Ashton, who was one of the three FX traders that were served up to the US courts, and they actually stood trial in New York and were acquitted. Now, it's understood, or it's suggested, that Barclays did it's a fact that Barclays at the last minute withdrew their legal funding of his defence, and it's understood and suggested by people with better qualified and better knowledge of this than me that it was in an effort to force Chris to plead guilty, so that then that would then destroy the defences of the other two defendants who were being funded by Citibank and JP Morgan respectively. So, but unfortunately for Barclays and what we understand to be the DOJ, the lawyers of Rohan Ramchandani, the Citibank trader, and JP Morgan's Richard Usher agreed to fund Chris's defence as well and take that on as well. Hence, he was able to defend it. But otherwise, he would have been facing a similar position. And it was, again, Barclays. He worked for Barclays. They just pulled the rug.
That surely is one reform we should well, the people generally who care about this stuff should be suggesting, perhaps, is, I mean, I'm not advocating a particular reform or not, but one idea that people have had is that you remove the ability of money to determine justice by making it all publicly funded.
Yeah.
Just make it all publicly funded. And then you can't have a bank messing with justice on the basis that it's got pots of money because it can create money from nothing. And, it's very easy to make profits, certainly if interest rates are high.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that way. And you could just change it by having it all publicly funded.
Yeah. or a tribunal system. I mean, if I'm bringing a case in the first tier tribunal system, it doesn't cost me anything. And that's over freedom of information laws. Employment tribunal. Okay, you'll go, well, when I say it doesn't cost you anything, you can bring it yourself. It's fairly straightforward, but equally, you're not liable to the other side's costs. So the same in the employment tribunal, first tier tribunal. Elsewhere, you go to a judicial review, you can apply for a cost capping order. But again, any other civil litigation, the costs and the risks are just too great. And that's why John Glenn and the government desperately sought to avoid the tribunal system for SMEs, and then said go with BBRS, which was, well, less said about the BBRS, the better. But again, it's the system. It's leveraging costs, and also removing the. Let's face it. All of those prosecuted had the right to avail themselves of a variety of free and objective rights under laws. They had every right to expect that the FCA would uphold their rights under law. They would provide honest and objective review, as they should do as regulators and as prescribed persons in under PIDA, and that's a free and objective and a free service or free right that you have. But they didn't, and not only did they not, they then absolutely perverted themselves and actually acted in the perversion of justice against those individuals. So, so deprived of the free, honest and objective review, and left with criminal prosecutions, and the only option to try and overturn these or to defend themselves is expensive civil litigation that those in oversight know that nobody can afford. And I've got a case I'm applying for judicial review on that very subject at the minute, and that the three regulators involved exhausted the free process with intent to leave me no option but civil litigation they knew I couldn't afford, so as to avoid accountability. And I know that I'm talking about my case, but I would say the same applies to all of these traders that have been subject to similar process. All three processes have been deprived of them. Same with SMEs as well, and then because the regulators and the hierarchy of oversight know that nobody's got the depth of pocket to pursue a civil litigation. I was quoted, just for example, the judicial review that I'm applying for, I got 3 different quotes. The cheapest was £270,000. you know, and the most expensive is £340,000. That should bring a judicial review against public bodies that have breached their statute, or you're alleging to breach their statutory obligations. How is that appropriate? How is that not a free process like it is with the first tier tribunal? I know I've gone off the point a little bit here, but I was in Parliament about 6 months ago when Karen Baxter, who's now at the FCA, and if anyone doesn't know Karen Baxter, she was former commander of City of London Police, and as you know, they have, you know, carte blanche over economic crime. And she said at this parliamentary thing about the future of economic crime enforcement, she said, what it is, victims don't really care about prosecution, they just care about getting their money back. And it's like, and I put my hand up and said, I've got to challenge that, because right, you know, a prosecution and a jail term is not just part of justice, it's a deterrent. And if you don't have appropriate justice and people doing jail time or appropriate jail time, we're not talking about like going on witch hunts here, but the people involved in the prosecutions we're talking about now, if they are not held accountable, like the post office scandal, right? If they are not held accountable, well, what's to stop anyone in the future doing it? You know, we've seen it in scams where scammers aren't held accountable. It's just a green light for everybody else to just go ahead and do the same thing. So, you know, for me, it's important that the people involved here in lowballing, in what Andy's book exposes, that they are questioned under caution, and they are brought to trial, and they are forced to stand, you know, to stand trial or be held accountable for what they've done. And if they don't, then, you know, because I can guarantee you what happened in LIBOR, because they got away with it, they did the same in FX. They did witch hunts there. I'm not saying that the guys in FX were necessarily innocent, but you know, they singled out individuals, whereas it was industry wide what was going on there. So you either prosecute all or none. But what they did, they manufactured or manipulated a very limited a perception that was very limited. You know, only 6 banks involved, and therefore that deprived those traders that were sacked at those banks the defence, which the FCA code said at the time, an absolute defence against an allegation of market abuse and manipulation is if it's an industry standard practice. Same applied in libel. That's why they tried to serve you all up as individual scapegoats or lone rogues in all of your things, because then you couldn't rely on it was widespread, you know, therefore, you know, that's an absolute defence. And they did it in FX, punished 6 banks when they knew it was absolutely widespread. And but they were encouraged to do it because they got away with it in LIBOR. Why wouldn't you do it again? And why wouldn't you do it with IRHPs? And why wouldn't you do it with anything else? So I think, and what you see as well, like Andy talks about 800 million discount for LIBOR for cooperation. Really? What cooperation is? Volunteering and serving yourself up the moment you find it. It isn't cooperating only when the cat's out of the bag and you've been found guilty and everything else. That's not cooperation. So how do you get a discount for that? That should be, you know, in my opinion, that should be a multiple of it. You know, if you've had 3 years to fess up to this and you haven't done, then when you're caught out and then you finally agree to cooperate, and by cooperation I mean serve up scapegoats like Matt, Carlo, PJ, then how's that cooperation? And how do you get a discount for that? You should find a multiple of what the fine would otherwise have been, because you've had 3 years to fess up and you didn't. So I think there's it's not a vindictive thing, it's not a revenge thing, it's appropriate. It's appropriate justice. But what we all end up we're made to feel is that, okay, that's better than it could have been. And then we kind of accept that, and without realizing that it's just an invitation then to do it again. So I know I've gone on quite a bit on that point, Andy, and I was trying to be succinct, but Andy and Verity did interrupt me, so I had to carry on. So, right, but there's a couple of broad things that I want to mention here. The UK justice system, I know it's an adversarial system and everything else, but the UK justice system has an overriding objective. I mean, and anyone who's been through the system perhaps know what it is, but the overriding objective is that justice is seen to be done. Right, so even an adversarial system, that's the overriding objective. What about the libel prosecutions is in any way abiding by that overriding objective? They knew justice wasn't being done. They absolutely rode roughshod over that, and in addition to all the other laws and everything else, and the obligations of public officers that were involved in this. And yet again, here we are, nothing being done. And I'm going to rattle through these, Andy. I know. So what Andy's book highlights is something I've been banging on about for probably 6 or 7 years myself, and it's it exposes the hierarchy of oversight at every level. There's either failure and or dishonesty at every level. The compliance and the executives of the banks, then you've got the Bank of England, then you've got the FCA, then you've got the Treasury, then you've got the Cabinet Office, and then you've got the SFO, and then you've got the judiciary potentially. They all fell in line. They all knew that this was nonsense, but nobody in that hierarchy chose to say, well, hang on, that's not right. They just went, okay, we know that's not right, but you know what, we'll just fall in line and we'll just carry it up the chain. That's not how that hierarchy of oversight is supposed to work. And I think that's what Andy's book really does expose. Another point we've made, and Andy touched on it as well, there is no access to justice anymore. The legal aid system, the whole thing's a complete sham. And for reasons I've just described, all the free processes are completely denied you by the failures or dishonesty of those that are supposed to be upholding these laws. And we're in a situation where justice now depends not on the weight of evidence, because historically injustice took place because there was a lack of evidence. Here we have a system where justice isn't being done despite overwhelming evidence. What you've got in Andy's book, obviously Andy's bringing this to public light now, but all these people have had this evidence in their possession for donkey's years. So how is it that this is only exposed by a journalist? Right now, it's an incredible piece of work, and hopefully this will then lead to something much more. But this is justice depending on not weight of evidence, but the depth of your pockets. And unfortunately, and we've seen this in other things as well, is that the brightness of the media spotlight, you can shine on it. That shouldn't be the case, but it sadly is. If you can't get coverage of it and you can't get a spotlight, and you can't, because the media spotlight, all of a sudden, whoa, hang on, too much is being done here, too many people might know, and then all of a sudden, like Watchdog, BBC Watchdog is probably the best example. How many people go on there, 3 years of absolute nonsense, stonewalling by the company involved. As soon as BBC Watchdog are on it, oh, we're so sorry, we can't apologise enough. The spotlight, without that spotlight, nothing seems to get done. And that's a sad state of affairs when, to rely on justice in the UK today, you need that spotlight.
Can I respond to that, Paul? And we are dominating a bit. We should let other people speak. But I just think that one thing that reflection I have on the whole rigged story, and thanks very much for your kind words, is that it shows how the power inheres in the story. So what's at issue is a story. The prosecutor says, these traders have been dishonest. They were asking each other to tweak their libel submissions up or down. It's bad. And look how much they're paid, and lock them up. That's the sort of prosecutor's story. It's full of sensational power. It has emotional force. They tell the jury about J Merchant's pay. I mean, God, the guy got more than £1 million bonuses. Most of those people on the jury were probably paid less than 30 grand. It's enough to make you resent someone as being a living, breathing illustration in the same room there with you of economic injustice. So I believe in the libel trials where defendants were found guilty, it was largely the juries not really understanding something, but understanding that they're punishing an overpaid banker. And here was a rare opportunity to punish an overpaid banker. There was a guy who was smiling throughout Stelios's trial with a little half smile on his face, and John Matthew and oh, can you not hear me?
No, we can, yeah.
There was a guy who was smiling throughout, there was a little half smile on his face on the jury in the first Barclays trial in 2016. And I always speculate, I can't know this for sure, but I think he was enjoying the idea that he had been given this great opportunity to condemn bankers, those overpaid traders. He had worked at a bank, apparently. We had speculation or information that he'd worked at a bank, and maybe he was someone who's paid a lot less than a trader. Maybe, who knows? But he certainly seemed to be enjoying the opportunity to punish some bankers. And I think that was true, unfortunately, of the jury in Stelios's trial. I don't know if he's still with us, but Carlo's trial, where he says in the interview he gave, and it's quite a chilling quote. He says, it's very scary. It's actually in the Lobel tapes as well, to be in a situation where a bunch of young people are doing the bidding of authority without really knowing what they're doing, and they appear to be enjoying it. The jurors came back in before they pronounced him guilty with little half smiles on their faces. Clearly the story was something to do with, we're doing something righteous and good here. We're punishing economic injustice. There was a great little text there about somebody in the Holocaust. Someone put on the chat about how when these Americans wanted to stone the Nazis, an understandable impulse when you've seen a huge pile of bodies. One of the people who'd been an inmate in that camp couldn't join in. That's kind of where Carlo is as well, isn't it? You know, it's kind of, and really, when you think about the Holocaust itself, and, you know, here I know I'm going beyond my brief, this is just a personal view. You know, the Holocaust itself was a scapegoating. In a way, the Jews were scapegoats for everything bad that had happened to Germany. They're a way of directing the public's anger, and it's a thing that power does. If there's anger moving around, it's a great big powerful political force. If you can direct it the right way, you can use it. So it's not to say that the Nazis weren't genuinely racist. Of course they were. Of course they were anti-Semitic, virulently, viciously, particularly Himmler and all those other people who conducted the Holocaust. But they were doing what they were doing. The conversation that they were having was they were getting rid of something bad. They were condemning something bad, and they were getting rid of something bad. And have this as a thought. This is a thought I didn't put into my epilogue, but it's a thought I've often had. Could it possibly be true that the worst evil is always done in a bid to stamp out evil? Wow. Could that possibly be true? That the worst evil is fired by an impulse to stamp out wrongdoing? Could that be true? I don't know. I kind of think it's quite a strong. It could explain quite a lot. So the Holocaust was a bit of a scapegoating. The story here, on a much lesser scale, of course, people were killed. The comparison is in a way is invalid, except insofar as it reflects a human tendency, which is to when we perceive something's gone wrong, to wish to condemn, to stone someone, etc. But I think Carlo's right to be the guy who says, no, don't stone someone. That's the bad part of us wants to do that. Let's appeal to the cerebral in ourselves, the sociable in ourselves, the good side of ourselves, not the side that condemns and enjoys people going to prison or being stoned.
I'm going to cut in there if I may, Andy and Paul. We're going to hear from Lisa. It's 5 to 8 UK time. We're going to finish at roughly 8:15 at the very, very latest. Okay, we're going to start bringing things to a nice, tidy close. Lisa, before you speak, could I please just check with you? Have you got somebody with you at home today, Lisa? Can I just check that before you speak? You have, lovely. Please, Lisa, take yourself off mute and then share your thought. Thank you. There we go.
I'm okay, yeah?
If you can be succinct for me, please, Lisa, so we can squeeze as many in before we need to wrap up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, thank you for giving me a platform, Andy. I do appreciate it. Now, for those who don't know me, I'm speaking on a personal perspective here, not trade inside, not an SME, but an individual. And what has happened on an individual scale is no different to what happened to the traders, SMEs, HBOS Reading. It's all the same, but on a personal scale. So I'll condense it as quickly as I can. My late husband was sacrificed by Lloyd's Banking Group, the FSA and the FOS in order to protect themselves and to discredit a whistleblower, Paul Carlier, for bringing my late husband's experience of wrongdoing was off the scale, absolutely off the scale. And what they tried to do, and they almost succeeded. I can't tell you how close it came. What they did is they tried their hardest to use my late husband as the sacrificial lamb to destroy Paul Carlier so that any future things that he brought, wrongdoings that he would highlight, they would say, oh yes, but look, it was his fault that my husband, Peter, lost his home and the family and everything else. And they do that because they know that judges aren't going to cross them, they're going to praise them. And it's just an individual, it doesn't matter, there's loads of those. And until this imbalance changes, there are lots of individuals, just like my late husband and myself, who will spend the rest of their lives fighting for justice, for an apology, for these organisations to accept what they're doing to people. They're ruining lives. We may not go to prison, but it's like being in prison, because you're forever fighting and your life is on a permanent treadmill of trying to get to the truth and justice. And when you do eventually get the details that you know exist, they just deny them. And when I heard the recording, and I'll just use the initial PJ, I can't remember his full name, of his outrage at having to do what he was being told to do, it reminded me of a recording that I had and Paul Carley had received of my late husband begging the bank for help and support that he should have had, because the rules and regulations exist. They're there, but you don't know them. The individual doesn't know them, but they do. And it's just wrong. No one wants to hear the tragic stories of individuals and their families who grow. Yeah, sorry, Andy.
I only want to contradict you in one respect. It's not true that no one wants to hear. Okay.
Oh,
and
okay.
That's true. I'm not saying I can do anything about it. I'm not saying I can be effective about it. I'm not even saying that I can necessarily broadcast anything about it, but I will listen. So why don't we get sometime and I hear your story more fully? Shall we do that?
Yeah, I did actually meet you once at the
I know,
BBC.
I remember, but it was quite brief, wasn't it? So why don't we spend a few hours together and tell me a story in greater length? And you know, if it can be done, it can. If it can't, it can't. But
no,
you know,
that's fine.
Tell me a bit more. Yeah.
I would appreciate, Andy, thank you for that, if Paul Carlier could be involved in it, because
sure. I know Paul. I know Paul. We've talked a lot. So yeah,
he was instrumental in our case. He really was. And
yeah, I need to get to know that story better. So let's have a big coffee and a walk in the park and have a big chat about it at some point. Okay.
Thank you, Andy.
Okay. Thank you, Andy, for giving me a platform.
Well, it's nice to see you smiling. So you know, anything. I think everybody here would like to see you smiling.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Lisa. And thank you, Paul Carlier. Mr. Nicholas Wilson, back to you. If anybody else wants to come in before we wrap up, please raise your hand digitally if you don't know how to do it old school. Nicholas Wilson, thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to report something that happened in the middle of my campaign, which sort of refers back to something Carlo was talking about and this whole moral thing, because the fraud that I was fighting against was basically committed by a bank called HFC Bank, which HSBC purchased in 2003, I think it was. Incidentally, that was the beginning of the credit crisis in the States. But anyway, the CEO of HFC Bank, Adrian Hill, committed suicide as a result of my campaign because he thought he was going to go to prison. Now, even bearing that in mind, nothing happened. I even said, I had a meeting shortly after that at the FCA and said to Andrew Bailey, you know, is the suicide of Andrew Hill got anything to do with how we move forward now? And they just shuffled their feet and were terribly embarrassed about the whole thing. But I was in a dilemma because I felt vindicated. This guy knew how big it was. He knew how massive the fraud was, and he killed himself. But it was still treated as a little peccadillo by the FCA and the police and the SFO and everybody. And it was covered up by camera and blah, blah, blah. This poor man
thought he was going to go to prison. There is no way he would have gone to prison. It's traders like Carlo and Tom Hayes that go to prison.
Can I come back to you on that, Nick? Because and by the way, may I say I've admired your work over the years. You know, you're driven
We didn't get off
a seed of moral indignation, driven by a seed of moral indignation, without which democracy doesn't function, I think. But it's interesting to hear you talk about suicides, and the truth is that these things, when you're up against a huge commercial force, you know, overpaid lawyers using unscrupulous tactics who seem to have limitless funds, then, you know, life is not unstressful, and it really gets to you. And I'm sure you know that, Lisa, and lots of other people.
I've been suicidal myself, but I suspect in his case that they were going to scapegoat him. I suspect he was going to be hung out to dry.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you were there in Parliament last week, but Danny Wilkinson, you know, he talked about, he actually described how he'd been driving at 130 down the motorway, ready to crash into the barrier. He described how his mum gave him big knives for cooking, and he was thinking of using them, because he makes that calculation of well, if I'm not here, they can't do anything to my family. That's what he was thinking. And you know, I mean, in Peter Johnson's case, he just, you know, couldn't see any hope if he was carted off to the States thousands of miles from his family. You know, his life really was completely wrecked, would be completely wrecked.
But is it not? I mean, it's very, very rare. It happens more in the States, but it's very rare in this country that bankers commit suicide. They don't seem to have that.
Well, let me give you one example. There's a guy in the LIBOR scandal, not in the book, called Brooksmith, and Matt Connolly is probably not still on this call, but oh, are you? Well, why don't you give the story of Brooksmith? Hi, Matt.
Hi. No, you have more credibility telling it than I do.
Well, okay, my understanding, and most of my information is from Matt on this, is that he had a compliance role, didn't he, in Deutsche Bank, and he looked at LIBOR and came out with findings which were later not in line with what the regulators had decided, because they decided on this misconceived stuff that the US courts have now agreed was misconceived. But the regulators at the time, even though Brooksmith was effectively concluding what the courts would conclude years later, it really wrecked his life, didn't it? Can you tell a bit more, because you know a lot more, Matt?
So he was a risk manager at Deutsche Bank, and he was kind of a project manager for Anshu Jain. Whenever anything big came up, he would kind of jump into it. And he exonerated a bunch of traders early on in 2009. He did his own little investigation and investigating the big trade that Deutsche Bank did involving LIBOR, and came to the conclusion that no fraud was done on that trade, and with the money was above board, nothing was mismarked. And a few years later, they turned around and blamed him, because the UK and US courts were now saying that any activity in LIBOR was basically criminal activity and fraud. And it was a different conclusion than he came up with. So he got blamed at Deutsche Bank for screwing up the investigation. And the Department of Justice got involved, and they started interviewing juniors, and he felt, from everything I found, that he was going to be the senior executive scapegoat at Deutsche Bank for the LIBOR investigation, because they were blaming his conclusions for why the Department of Justice was coming down so hard on Deutsche Bank. So he ended up killing himself, hanging himself with a leash, leaving a lot of suicide notes. But it was directly around the time when the Department of Justice was contacting people to get them to plead guilty and flip on the next guy and flip on the next guy. And he felt that he was going to be 2 or 3 up the chain. He was the guy who was going to end up paying for this, whether it be obstruction of justice or being involved in the fraud himself, since he investigated it and didn't come up with anything. So, and he was fairly senior at Deutsche Bank, you know, and he wasn't going to be prosecuted, but you know, that's the feeling that, you know, Nick was talking about as well, is
it's the finger of blame, isn't it, Matt?
yeah.
And is that
Shame and the finger of blame.
Yeah, which is in a way the sort of evil focus of the whole story, and it is for SMEs too, because they are made to feel a failure. It's your fault, you know. It's your fault that things went wrong. The finger of blame is pointing at you, and power points the finger of blame. Power and wealth points the finger of blame, and you to get it turned around is, you know, no, it's actually the media's fault. You know, no, it's actually power and influence's fault. We're having the wrong conversations,
right?
Because power in here is in the wrong conversation. If a false story is told, you have to tell the true story with maximum force. And power will resist, just like the Vatican resisted the idea that it was Jesus's blood. You know, its power depends on that story, and you have a whole war of Reformation and counter-Reformation because of apparently that story. But the power in here is in the story. So if you can change the story, you maybe have overcome that power. But that's how difficult it is. You've got to gather all kinds of force to sort of subvert this story that is oppressing people. Whether it's, you know, the Jews are bad people, or whether it's SMEs are failures, and of course that's on a different scale. Whether it's SMEs are failures, whether it's it was Matt Connolly, him who did it, not his junior trader, even though he hated LIBOR, and even though he only wrote 3 emails 12 years ago, it's him. Power says it's him. You know, there's so much so much of the power is invested in the story, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We'll pick up this theme in relation to what I think Andy Candy might be speaking about in just a moment. Andy, please share your thought. Thank you.
Hi guys. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk, Andy. Just want to convey my admiration and solidarity, dare I say, with Andy Verity and all the traders and the support teams with them as well, their families, the lawyers, everything. I mean, it's just an astonishing story. I mean, I was at the House of Commons last week and just sat there gobsmacked and practically in tears hearing the accounts and of what's gone on. It's a truly shocking indictment of the oversight of financial trust in this country and the justice system. Just mind-blowing. It's been interesting actually, sort of considering that we're sort of sat here 10 years on really from when this all sort of generally kicked off between 08 and 12 and what have you, when things finally got moving. And you sort of reminding me of Andy Verity's panorama on the small businesses and asset stripping, and then Adam Shaw's on swaps specifically that really started to open this all up. And it's interesting reading the book and the details in there, and it's like going back and reliving all of what was going on at the time, and then actually understanding more about what was going on behind the scenes. And you've got this, dare I say, pretty dog shit rate of LIBOR that's been being manipulated at the top levels, but also being used to price and missell swaps and various other products, financial products, to SMEs. So it's all interrelated, and it's quite fascinating when you sort of take that overview of everything that's gone on and how the traders were sort of scapegoated to sort of, you know, distract entirely from what was actually going on the sort of grander scheme of things. And it's interesting that in the book, in terms of the defense or the prosecution, I should say, trying to actually find who the victims of this were. You know, even trying to come down to looking at the traders and deciding they couldn't even work out monetarily how much they benefited either from a box of sushi or a round of coffees, or, you know, maybe a trip to a tropical island or whatever else, which was complete nonsense. And I think we all remember there's a bottle of Bolly in it for you, mate, if you do this. And when you're talking about 1 or 2 bips in the overall scheme of things, it's utterly mind-blowing. And people talk about in the sense, you know, they're making a Hollywood film of this, and yes, sensationalist and horrific abuse of human rights and everything else, it actually qualifies. But I think people would also sit there and go, how in the hell were these people convicted on such lack of evidence? I mean, it's got to be focused surely on all the corruption and collusion that's gone on. How many millions of dollars spent by law firms to come up with 2 or 3 or 4 emails where they're actually just conducting ordinary business. It's utterly mind-bending.
It is mind-bending, and Carlo, I think, has gone, but he describes very eloquently how he probably
He's there.
Oh, is he still there?
He's still there.
Oh, Carlo, I'm
Yeah.
the Kafka-esque nature of it. That you, I mean, you gave me so many great quotes, but it's especially this sense. And my daughter's reading The Trial at the moment, so I was trying to say, yeah, no, read my book. It's real and it's more current. But Kafka's The Trial, he identified this thing, and you've read Kafka, haven't you? And do you want to give us just a bit more of a sense of that? Just riffing off what Andy just said there, it's you're in this situation. I don't want to send you to a dark place, but where they're like, no, don't want to hear, not interested, want to condemn you, want to send you to prison, don't want to hear your exculpatory explanations, shut up. It's kind of like that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like, they're accusing you of things that don't make any sense, and they don't even try to listen to your answer. They're not you're trying to explain things to them, and they're like not willing to listen, not willing to engage, responding things that have nothing to do with what you've been just saying, and then kind of summing up what you just said to the jury in ways that have absolutely nothing to do with what you've just been saying. And you're having these parallel conversations to people that are like that you're not really talking to, that you can't really be talking to. They're just there. It's like a power that you have no contact with. You cannot have any conversation with anything. You just you're not even there as a person in front of somebody else.
Yeah. And you can't reason with it, can you? It doesn't have any ears.
No, it doesn't have anything. None, like zero. Like what you say, whether you say something or you say nothing at all, makes absolutely no difference, because their decision has already been written anyway in a completely different language from anything that you would ever say.
A thought's coming to my mind here, Carlo. For you and the other traders, it must have been like living a nightmare. I can't think of any other way of trying to describe how I imagine it must have been. Talking sense to people who are refusing to accept the sense in what you're saying. Imagine somebody summing up what was just being said in the court, but just summing up a completely different narrative. I mean, how you guys kept saying, I just don't know. It's just incredible.
Can I say as well that I've had the same from the other perspective, where I'm blowing the whistle, I'm telling people, and it's falling on deaf ears. Literally nobody's listening. So it's the opposite, if you like, of what you guys had. You're telling a story, nobody's listening, and your livelihoods and your freedoms are on the line. But I've had exactly the same thing when you're trying to, you're blown. This is going on. This was wrong, and literally nobody's listening, or they are listening. They know that you're onto something, and they just don't want to hear. And it's a similar thing. So when you get in, you have both, it's only going to end in injustice.
Thank you. We'll jump back to Andy Candy, then to Mark Bishop. Then
I just wanted to hear a bit more from Carlo, because I think he wanted to say a bit more.
Oh, sorry, forgive me. Go on, Carlo. Thank you.
No, I was just gonna quickly say that I've also had the Paul's experience when I tried to blow the whistle against Barclays, and I had meetings with Barclays legal team. Then following that, I had meetings with the FCA, FSA legal team. We're discussing my whistleblowing, and all of the evidence of my meetings have gone. So now I know that I have been there, having meetings with these people, speaking to this kind of people. But all that I have is the email confirming the time and the location of the meeting, which they also don't seem to have found anymore, but at least I have that.
Yeah, and that was a key part of your defense, wasn't it? No, you weren't a defendant, you were a whistleblower, and you'd blown a whistle at some misconduct. And
no, yeah, but now, like, apparently all the evidence is gone. The FCA is completely denying that I've ever had this kind of meeting. Barclays is not even responding to my request about information about my meetings.
Sorry, Andy, I interrupted you, but I was just
think you're crazy.
Yeah, Carlos was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what you've done, Andy, brilliantly in the book is to simplify all the technical jargon and everything else so that people can really get shocked by the fact that this 1 or 2, 3 bips manipulation, or should I say correct application of is what's been used to suggest that they've been up to inappropriate or illegal activity retrospectively. That's what's insane. And similarly with the swap situation, we've got something called interest rate margin accounting, which is an absolutely standard part of the thing, of the process, of the product. And yet any swaps trader will tell you that it exists, how it operates. Indeed, in the pensions issues that we've had with when Truss and Kwarteng made their budget and all the margin calls suddenly went into the funds and panic sort of ensued. You're looking at the exact same mechanism that was concealed from small businesses on their swaps, not declared to them, but was utilized to put them into the GRG abattoirs and asset stripping parts of the banks. And yet the whole establishment, the same cabal of people that have been instrumental in the LIBOR rigging cover up and false prosecutions are instrumental in the same cover up of this margin accounting fraud that's been perpetrated on thousands of UK SMEs and is still being, kicked into the touch and concealed. And it's just quite fascinating that, hopefully what you've managed to do with LIBOR is really bring this to the top of the tree. So whereas before it was all kept amongst the relationship managers and lower order, when it clearly wasn't, it was absolutely from the top down. Again, with this LIBOR stuff, you followed the paper trail right the way to the top to, to Tucker, to the Bank of England, to instructions from the, from the West, from, the offices of Treasury, the Prime Minister, etc., etc. And that's where it needs to go. We need that level of focus and attention to go. We cannot have this level of corruption and fraud overseeing our economy, the safety of our nation in that sense. Because unless you expose it and put sunlight on it and get it out there in the open, that's just going to fester. And that's why we've got an economic problem in many regards, certainly among SMEs, because there's no trust and there's just outright, Wild West activity going on. So hopefully all the pressure that can be brought to get this stuff into backbench debates, get it into the public forum and get it exposed, irrespective of whether we're demanding people are thrown in prison or not or whatever, but that level of sunlight and exposure and that transparent, open operating process, that's what needs to be put into place so that this doesn't happen again, or at least the risk of it happening again is substantially reduced. And I think that's what we need to hopefully, and you've got my 100% support in doing this, is bringing it into Parliament under parliamentary privilege and scrutiny, and hopefully with the supports of Lord Thierry and others now saying serious questions need to be answered by some senior individuals on this matter in front of the Treasury Select or other organisations. So thank you, Andy. I'll shut up now.
No, thank you, and you're spot on about so many things. I'd love to actually meet up with you and have a coffee and chat about stuff, as we're with quite a few people on this forum over the next few weeks and months. So thank you. I should probably get going. We've been talking wonderfully stimulating conversation, but I think I might get in trouble with
What we'll do, if we may, Andy, what we'll do is this. We'll get a very short piece from Mark. I'd then like to go to Carlo for final comments, just nice and brief, Carlo, to Matt Connolly for final comments, and then back to yourself, Andy, for final comments. So let's wrap up within 5 minutes, guys, okay? So Mr. Mark Bishop, as succinctly as possible, share your thought. Thank you.
I just want to add the support to what Andy Candy has said, and really the logical consequence of what many other people have been saying, which is this. While I absolutely don't think that the solution is, lynchings and stoning people to death, I also think the solution has to be some level of justice and vindication for those who've been mistreated, and some level of humiliation, angst, and deprivation of economic power of those who are really responsible, and that's both for the lowballing and particularly for the scapegoating. And I think that is necessary to protect all of us, actually. You can't have a situation where regulators and prosecution authorities turn a blind eye to one group of people behaving badly while actually fitting up another group.
Mark, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Carlo Palumbo, your final comments, please.
I mean, I don't know what to say. My final comments, I just, I hope this will be over one day. I can only be, thankful for everyone that supported us.
Carlo, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. And Matt Connolly.
I want to thank everybody for all the support I've gotten in every way. You know, what Andrew Canny just said about the same people, the same system, the same way of doing business is creating victims everywhere. The SMEs with the mis-selling of the swaps, the GRG, all these scandals are related, and the authorities and the power that made it all happen use us against each other. You know, they'll point fingers at us, and they want SMEs and individuals to hate us, and they do that on purpose to keep the spotlight off of them. So anything we can do to stick together and highlight all these scandals, what happened to me is not any worse than what happened to you and what happened to all these countless stories. We're all victims, and I think if we stick together and try to keep the spotlight on this wherever we can, we have our best chance to change things. And that's about it.
Wow, Matt, that's so thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Mr. Andy Verity, you have our friendship, our respect, our admiration. Your work is simply outstanding. You heard tonight yourself, Andy, somebody saying, if it wasn't for what you did, they would have been sent to jail. Andy, your final thoughts, please, sir.
Well, wow, yeah, exactly. And you feel if you've helped justice, then you've achieved something. And you know, I think everybody on this forum is engaged in the same project in that regard. It's justice of whatever shape or form it takes. In order to get justice, I believe that you have to change the story first. And this is why it frustrates me so much that lawyers advise clients, whether it might be Carlo or Matt or whoever, not to talk to the media. The media is here, is an advance. It's an advance on feudalism, the media. You know, it's the ability to have a democratic forum. It's something that was in ancient Greece. It's something that has been in modern times. It's something that wasn't in feudal times, medieval times, or times when the church dominated. You didn't have free speech then either. Free speech is a precious modern public good that we need to work to maintain. And also and the reason that we have to work to maintain it is power doesn't like hearing it. You know, just look at Russia, look at China if you want an illustration of that. Power doesn't like hearing dissent. It doesn't like that, you know. So if liberty means anything at all, it means telling wealthy and powerful people what they don't want to hear. You know, or Alfred Harmsworth, news is something which annoys someone somewhere, all the rest is advertising. So, you know, I think, you know, part of the reason I participate in these events with enthusiasm and interest is because it's listening to people, it's hearing people that opens up your mind, you learn stuff, you know. Everybody has got an interesting story to tell you, and that's a fundamentally democratic attitude. There's no one out there who doesn't have an interesting story to tell you, so therefore you should listen. And that's a sort of democratic thing. In more practical terms, what we can do to change the conversation right now is, any of you who read the book who like it, and sorry to sound commercial and pluggy, but if you like it, write a review, because the more reviews there are on Amazon, the more it's up the Amazon algorithm, and the more that when people look up business books, they'll find my book. And that, so if you feel like leaving a review, they can tell if it's the same person leaving more than one, so just leave one. You know, and say what you really think as well. If there's criticisms you've got, please say what you think. You know, just help. You can help this particular conversation to change by doing that practical thing. And then it's also, I think, at the moment, if you feel so moved to write a letter to your MP about the book, then and ask them to ask Harriet Baldwin to reopen and to investigate what you think is a miscarriage of justice. They do need to have those incoming emails and letters. So those are just two practical things you can do. More broadly, I think, you know, there's a phrase in Indian culture which I think means, I used to say in yoga, which means I recognize the divine in you. And you say to each other, namaste. You know, we all on here trying to recognize the better part of human nature. And if that prevails, then you don't get the worst part of human nature winning out. So namaste, everyone.
On that note, namaste, big time to Andy Verity and the traders. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Well done, Andy. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.